October in Montana doesn't ask permission. It takes what it wants, and on this particular afternoon, it wanted everything. Rain hammered Highway 87 like the sky had finally decided to settle an old score. The kind of rain that turns asphalt into a river and makes even the pines bow their heads in submission. Dalton Sullivan had been riding for 42 years, long enough to know when weather was just weather and when it was something else. This was something else. The kind of storm that got inside your bones and reminded you that nature didn't care how many miles you'd logged or how many brothers you'd buried. It just kept coming. 59 years old. The number sat in his chest like a stone these days. In 6 months, he'd be 60. Not the years themselves that bothered him, but what they meant, what they took. 3 weeks ago, he'd scattered Wyatt Davidson's ashes off a cliff in Wyoming. Cancer had eaten through Hawk in 6 months, fast and merciless. And Dalton had watched the strongest man he'd ever known shrink down to nothing but pain and morphine and finally silence. The club had ridden back from that trip in formation, 40 bikes moving like a single organism through the mountain passes. But something had broken loose inside Dalton during that ride. Some gear that had been turning for 4 decades suddenly stripped, and now everything felt off-center. Wrong. He led the pack north on 87 rain, streaming off his helmet, his hands numb on the grips. Behind him, 39 engines rumbled in perfect synchronization. These men would follow him into fire if he asked, had followed him into worse. But lately, Dalton had been wondering what exactly he was leading them toward. More funerals, more memorials, more empty seats at the table. The thought came unbidden. Your next ghost. The clock's ticking. He pushed it down, focused on the road. That's when he saw her. A figure on the shoulder. An old woman, white hair plastered to her skull by the rain, both hands pressed against the trunk of an ancient Buick LeSabre. Pushing. The car hadn't moved an inch. Probably hadn't moved in 20 minutes, but she kept pushing anyway, with a determination that was either admirable or insane. Dalton's first instinct was to keep riding. Everyone else had. He could see the spray patterns on the asphalt where 18-wheelers had blown past her, not even slowing down. Nobody stops anymore. That's just how it is. But then something his mother had said 36 hours before cancer took her when he was 16 whispered through his mind like smoke. Find people who see you, Marcus. Not people who look at you and see what they expect. People who really see you. His mother had called him Marcus. Nobody else had in 43 years. The club knew him as Ghost had known him as Ghost since 1985, when he'd walked away from a wreck that should have killed him. The bike had been totaled. Dalton had stood up, brushed himself off, and kept riding. Like a ghost, someone had said. The name stuck. But looking at this old woman in the Reynoldian and ignored and still fighting something in him, made a choice before his brain caught up. Dalton raised his fist. The signal rippled back through the formation. 40 engines dropped from a roar to a rumble, then to an idle. The procession slowed, stopped, and suddenly the only sounds were rain and the hiss of wet asphalt. The woman straightened up as much as her spine would allow, didn't wave for help, didn't look grateful or relieved, just stood there, hands still on the car, watching them with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by leather and chrome. Dalton pulled off his helmet. Rain hit his face immediately, cold and sharp. "You all right, ma'am?" She wiped rain from her eyes with the back of one wrinkled hand. "Do I look all right, despite everything, despite the weight in his chest and the storm and the ghost of Hawk riding beside him?" Dalton felt his mouth twitch. Almost a smile. "No, ma'am, you don't." "Then why'd you ask?" Behind him, he heard Garrett Ross let out a low whistle. The kid was 29, covered in tattoos, trying hard to be harder than he was. "She's got fire, Ghost." Dalton ignored him, stepped off his bike, planted his boots in the mud, and walked toward her. Slow, deliberate. The woman didn't back up, didn't flinch. Just stood there in the rain, one hand still on her car, like she was daring him to try something. "What happened?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. "Engine died." You call anyone, no phone. Dalton tilted his head slightly. You planning to push this thing and all the way into town? The woman's jaw tightened. Not anger, something else. Pride, maybe, or the kind of stubbornness that comes from 90-plus years of refusing to quit. If I have to. Rain drummed on metal and leather. 40 men sat on their bikes waiting, watching. This wasn't protocol. They had places to be, things to do, and none of it involved standing on Highway 87 in a downpour helping strangers. But Dalton turned back to the line and raised his hand. All right, boys, let's move it. 39 men dismounted as one. Boots hit gravel like thunder. They approached the Buick slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether this old woman would let them touch her car. But she stepped back, not because she was afraid, because she was smart enough to know when to let help happen. Front bumper, Dalton said, pointing. 4 on each side. Stay low. On 3. They surrounded the car. Tattooed arms, scarred knuckles, hands that had seen violence and loss and survival. Hands that were now pressed gently, almost reverently, against the frame of an old woman's Buick. 1. The woman watched them. These strangers. These men the world looked at and saw danger. 2. Dalton caught her eye. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just acknowledgement. 2 people who knew what it meant to keep going when everyone else had stopped. 3. They pushed. The car rolled forward. Not fast, not easy, but it moved. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the Buick slid across the wet asphalt, guided by 40 men who didn't have to stop, who didn't owe her anything, who could have kept riding and never looked back. But they didn't. Easy, Dalton called out. Watch the ditch. Got it, Ghost. Keep it steady. The woman stood in the rain, arms crossed over her chest, watching them work. Her eyes were wet, but it might have been the rain. After 50 yards, Dalton raised his fist again. Hold up. The men stepped back, breathing hard rain dripping from their beards and vests. Dalton turned to the woman. There's a pull-off about a quarter-mile up. We'll get you there. You can call a tow. She nodded, didn't thank him. Didn't need to. They pushed the car the rest of the way. By the time they reached the pull-off, every one of them was soaked through muscles burning. But nobody complained. Nobody asked for anything in return. Dalton stood next to the woman as his brothers drifted back toward their bikes. Engines rumbled to life one by one, a symphony of American steel and defiance. You need a ride somewhere, he asked. She shook her head. I'll manage. You sure? I'm sure. Dalton nodded, started to turn, then stopped. Pulling a card from his vest pocket, handed it to her. The rain immediately started to blur the ink. You ever need anything, call that number. The woman took the card, looked down at it, then back up at him. Why? Because you didn't flinch when we pulled up, Dalton said quietly. And that tells me more about you than anything else could. He walked back to his bike. The others were already mounting up, ready to ride. But Dalton paused, looked back one more time. The woman was still standing there, small and soaked and unbroken, staring at the card in her hand. Then he kicked his bike to life and led his brothers back into the storm. 3 days later, Dalton's phone rang at 7 in the evening. He was alone in his apartment, which wasn't much to look at. 1-bedroom kitchenette, a couch that had seen better decades. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, him and Hawk 20 years younger standing in front of their bikes somewhere in Nevada. Both of them grinning like they'd figured out the secret to immortality. They'd been wrong. Dalton looked at the caller ID. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something, maybe the same instinct that had made him stop on the highway, made him pick up. Yeah, it's Eleanor Crawford. It took him a second. Then he remembered. The woman, the Buick, the rain. Ma'am. The woman with the car, she said as if reading his hesitation. On Highway 87. I remember. Everything okay? A pause. I wanted to say thank you properly. You already did. No, I didn't. Her voice was steady, clear. No quaver of age in it. I stood there in the rain and watched you leave. That's not the same as saying it. Dalton leaned back against his counter, surprised. Well, you're welcome. Another pause. Longer this time. Then where are you right now? Home. Why? What's the name of that place you and your friends came from? The Iron Horse. It's a roadhouse about 10 miles south of where we found you. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Eleanor said. Ma'am, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm coming anyway. She hung up before he could respond. Dalton stared at his phone for a long moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He laughed. Just once, short and sharp, but real. 20 minutes later, he was pulling into the parking lot of the Iron Horse when he saw it. A 1987 Buick LeSabre powder blue, parked between two Harleys, like it had every right to be there. Inside the bar was doing its usual Thursday night business. Dark wood neon signs buzzing in the windows, Skinner playing too loud on the jukebox. And sitting at a booth in the back, surrounded by curious bikers, was Eleanor Crawford. Every head turned when Dalton walked in. Conversation didn't stop exactly, but it changed, lowered, became watchful. Eleanor looked up. Their eyes met across the room. You came, Dalton said when he reached the booth. I said I would. He gestured to the seat across from her. Mind, it's your place. Dalton slid into the booth. Up close, he could see her more clearly than he had on the highway. White hair pulled back in a bun, sensible shoes, a cardigan that had seen decades of wear. But her eyes were sharp, alert, missing nothing. How'd you find me? He asked. Called the number on the card. Man answered, said Ghost was probably here. She paused. They call you Ghost. They do. Why, oh, old story, not a very interesting one. Eleanor smiled slightly. I doubt that. A waitress appeared, set down a glass of water without being asked. Dalton nodded his thanks. You want something? He asked Eleanor. I'm fine. They sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, just real. Around them, the bar slowly returned to normal volume. Pool balls cracked. Somebody fed quarters into the jukebox. So, Eleanor said finally, tell me. Tell you what? Why you really stopped? Dalton looked at her. Really looked. 92 years old, sitting in a biker bar at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, asking questions most people wouldn't dare ask. You want the truth. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. He leaned back in the booth. We were riding back from a memorial. For a friend. Brother, really. Wyatt Davidson, but everybody called him Hawk. What happened to him? Cancer. It was fast. Dalton's throat tightened slightly. 6 months from diagnosis to grave. Eleanor's expression softened. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. He looked down at his hands. 59 years of wear on them. Scars, calluses, the crooked pinky finger that had never set right after a bar fight in Reno. We'd been riding since dawn, passed a lot of people that day, saw a lot of folks who could have used help. But we kept riding because that's what we do. We ride for our own. But you stopped for me. Yeah. Why? Dalton met her eyes again. Because you reminded me of him. Hawk. The way you were standing there pushing that car like the whole damn world could burn down around you, and you just keep going. That was Hawk. Stubborn as hell. Wouldn't quit for nothing. Something shifted in Eleanor's face. Understanding, maybe. And because, Dalton continued, his voice quieter now, I saw you and I thought if that was my mother out there, I'd want someone to stop. Your mother's still alive. No, died when I was 16. I'm sorry, Dalton shrugged. Long time ago. But I remember her. Remember what she taught me. He paused. Stop for people. See them. Don't just look at them and see what you expect to see. See who they really are. Silence settled between them again. Not empty this time, full. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her skin was paper thin, spotted with age but warm, strong. Thank you, Dalton. He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. You're welcome, Eleanor. Over the next hour, the others came over. One by one at first, then in small groups, curious, cautious. This 92-year-old woman in sensible shoes sitting with Ghost like she belonged there. Garrett was first. The kid with the eagle tattoo spreading its wings across his neck, trying too hard to look dangerous. "This her?" he asked Dalton. "This is Eleanor Crawford. Eleanor, this is Garrett Ross." Garrett stuck out his hand. Eleanor shook it firmly. "You're the one who said I had fire," she said. Garrett blinked, surprised she'd heard him over the rain and engines. "Yes, ma'am." "You were right." The kid grinned despite himself. Silas Bennett came next. 40 years old, built like a mountain bear down to his chest. Used to be a mechanic before his wife died in a car accident 5 years back. Had a daughter, Marlo, 8 years old, living with his ex-sister-in-law in Billings because Silas didn't trust himself to be a father anymore. Road to keep from thinking too much. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Eleanor. "You helped push my car," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Silas's face did something complicated, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just nodded again and walked away. Boone Hayes was last. 52, covered in tattoos, every inch of skin a story. 2 tours in Iraq, came home to nothing, found the club, found purpose. His hands shook sometimes when he wasn't on a bike, but on a bike he was steady as bedrock. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at Eleanor with an expression Dalton couldn't quite read. "You okay, Boone?" Dalton asked. Boone nodded slowly. She reminds me of someone. Hupao, my grandmother, before she passed." He looked at Eleanor. "She used to tell me, don't let the world make you small, boy. You take up space. You matter." Eleanor's eyes glistened slightly. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." "Yes, ma'am, she was." Around 9 o'clock, Dalton walked Eleanor to her car. The parking lot was quieter now, just the sound of gravel under their feet and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. "You surprised them," Dalton said. "How's that? Most people see us and cross the street. You walked right in and sat down." Eleanor smiled. "I stopped being afraid of what people think a long time ago." Dalton laughed, a real one this time, deep and genuine. "I believe that." She opened her car door, then paused. "Dalton? Yeah, that brother of yours, Hawk, he would have been proud of what you did that day." Dalton's jaw tightened. He looked away, nodded. Eleanor got in her car, started the engine. Before she pulled away, Dalton leaned down to the window. "You know," he said, "you're welcome here any time." Eleanor looked up at him, at this man who had stopped in the rain when no one else would. "I might just take you up on that." She drove off into the night, taillights disappearing into the Montana darkness. Dalton stood there for a long time after she was gone, feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Maybe longer. Not quite hope, but something close. Something had shifted. 3 weeks later, Dalton's phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. He was in his garage, hands black with grease, trying to fix a carburetor issue on his bike that had been bothering him for days. The phone buzzed on the workbench. He almost ignored it, but it kept ringing. He wiped his hands on a rag picked up. "Yeah. Dalton, it's Eleanor." He straightened up, surprised. They'd talked a few times since that night at the Iron Horse. Short conversations, nothing heavy. But this felt different. Her voice had an edge to it he hadn't heard before. "Everything okay? I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange. Try me." A pause, then, "We're having a memorial ride for Hawk this Saturday, heading up to Yellowstone to scatter his ashes like we'd planned originally, and I was wondering if you'd want to come." Dalton blinked, stared at the carburetor in front of him like it might have answers. "You want me to ride with you?" "If you're up for it, we've got a support van. You could ride in that, or if you want to drive yourself, that's fine too." "Why?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Because Hawk would have liked you, and because I don't know. It feels right." Dalton looked around his garage, at the bike that wouldn't run right, at the walls covered in old rally posters and photographs of brothers who were mostly dead now, at the calendar on his workbench with nothing but empty squares stretching into next month and the month after that. "I'll be there," he said. Saturday morning came cold and clear. Dalton stood in the parking lot of the Iron Horse at 6 a.m. watching 40 motorcycles line up in formation. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the Montana sky pink and gold, and his breath came out in white clouds. He'd been up since 4, couldn't sleep, kept thinking about Hawk, about the last time they'd talked. It had been in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and dying. Hawk had been so thin by then, eaten hollow by the cancer, but his eyes were still sharp. "Ghost," Hawk had said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here, brother. Promise me something. Anything. Don't let this place kill you." Hawk had gestured weakly at the room, but Dalton knew he meant more than the hospital. He meant the weight, the endless responsibility, the slow grind of watching brothers fall and knowing you'd be next. Find something worth stopping for. Dalton had promised, held his friend's hand until the morphine pulled him under, and 3 days later, Hawk was gone. Now standing in the cold Montana morning, Dalton wondered if this was what Hawk had meant. This moment, this choice. Eleanor pulled up in her Buick at 6:15. Dalton walked over, opened her door. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." He led her to the support van at the back of the formation. But before she climbed in, Garrett called out, "Hey, Eleanor." She turned. The kid was holding out a leather vest. Plain, no patches yet, but worn soft with age and use. "This was Hawk's," Garrett said. "Figured you should wear it." Eleanor's throat closed. She took the vest, ran her fingers over the worn leather, felt the weight of it. All the miles, all the years. "You sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd want you to have it," Dalton said quietly. She put it on. It fit perfectly. They rode for 6 hours. Through mountains, past rivers, under skies so blue they hurt to look at. Eleanor sat in the van watching the motorcycles ahead of her, the way they moved together like a single organism. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, she felt like she belonged to something. When they reached Yellowstone, they gathered at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. 40 men formed a circle. Eleanor stood between Dalton and Garrett, wind whipping her white hair around her face. Dalton held up the urn. His hands weren't quite steady. "Wyatt Davidson," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "Brother, friend, pain in the ass." Laughter rippled through the group, but it was thick with tears. "You taught us what it meant to ride with honor," Dalton continued, "to never leave a man behind, to stop when others wouldn't." He looked at Eleanor. Their eyes met. "And today you brought us someone who reminded us why we do this." He opened the urn, held it up to the wind, poured the ashes out. They caught the sunlight, scattered like stars, disappeared into the valley below. Eleanor stood there, tears running down her face, wearing a dead man's vest, surrounded by 40 strangers who'd somehow become family. And she thought about her husband, Robert, about the argument they'd had the day he died, about the words she couldn't take back. "You never listened to me," she'd said, and then he'd clutched his chest and fallen. And those were the last words he ever heard from her. 25 years of guilt. 25 years of believing she didn't deserve to be close to anyone, because what if she said the wrong thing again? What if her words killed someone else she loved? But standing here now with the wind in her hair and Hawk's ashes drifting away, and Dalton looking at her like she mattered, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Not pain, permission. The ride back was quiet. Exhaustion and emotion had drained most of the brothers. They rode in formation, but slower now, almost meditative. Eleanor sat in the van next to Dalton, who decided to ride back with her instead of on his bike. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. "Thank you for coming." They drove in silence for a while. Then Eleanor spoke again. "What happens now?" Dalton looked at her. "What do you mean?" "With us, with this." She gestured between them, around them. "Do we just go back to our lives, pretend this didn't happen?" Dalton studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Eleanor, I don't think either of us knows how to pretend." She laughed despite herself. "Tell you what," Dalton said. "How about you come to the next club meeting, see what we're really about?" "You serious, dead serious?" Eleanor thought about her empty house, her empty calendar, her empty life. All right, she said, I'll come. And she did. The first meeting Eleanor attended, she walked in carrying a casserole dish. Dalton stared at it like she'd brought a live grenade. What's that tuna noodle? Eleanor said, setting it on the bar. Figured if I'm going to sit through 2 hours of motorcycle talk, you're all going to eat something that isn't fried. Garrett looked at Silas. Silas looked at Boone. Boone looked at Dalton. Dalton looked at Eleanor. You made us a casserole, he said slowly. I did. For a Hells Angels meeting. That's right. A beat of silence. Then Garrett started laughing. Deep, uncontrollable laughter that spread through the room like wildfire. Within seconds, the whole club was losing it. Eleanor crossed her arms. What's so funny? Nothing, Dalton said, fighting to keep a straight face. It's just nobody's ever brought us a casserole before. Well, now someone has, Eleanor said. And you're going to eat it. They did. Every last bite. 2 hours later, when the meeting wrapped up, Silas pulled Eleanor aside. That was the best thing I've eaten in 6 months, he said. Then you need to learn how to cook. Eleanor replied, Teach me. Eleanor blinked. What? Teach me how to cook. Seriously, my daughter's coming to visit next month and I can't keep feeding her takeout. Eleanor studied him. This huge man with hands like hammers who'd lost his wife and was fighting just to see his daughter, who rode motorcycles to keep the grief at bay. All right, she said. Next Tuesday, my place, 6 o'clock. Bring an apron. Silas grinned, and it transformed his whole face. Yes, ma'am. That was the first crack, the first moment when Eleanor stopped being the woman they helped on the highway and became something else entirely. By the end of the month, 3 more guys had asked her for cooking lessons. By the end of 2 months, she was running a weekly class out of her kitchen, teaching bikers how to make things their mothers might have taught them if their mothers had stuck around. Dalton showed up to the 3rd class unannounced. You cook? Eleanor asked, surprised. No, Dalton admitted, but I figured I should learn what you're teaching my guys. Your guys can speak for themselves. I know. That's what worries me. Eleanor laughed and handed him a cutting board. Chop those onions. Dalton picked up the knife, stared at the onion like it had personally offended him. You've probably killed men, Eleanor said, and you can't chop an onion. Dalton's head snapped up. Relax, Eleanor said. I'm joking. She paused. Mostly. He shook his head, fighting a smile, and started chopping. Halfway through the lesson, there was a knock on Eleanor's door. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Linda Peterson, the kind of woman who organized the church bake sale and knew everyone's business before they did. She froze when she saw 5 Hells Angels crowded around Eleanor's kitchen counter, flour on their vests, listening to a 92-year-old woman explain the difference between baking soda and baking powder. Eleanor, Linda said slowly, carefully, are you okay? I'm fine, Linda. Are these men? They're my friends, Eleanor said firmly, and they're learning to bake. Linda looked like she'd been slapped. Your friends? That's right. The Hells Angels. You got a problem with that? Garrett asked, not looking up from the dough he was kneading. Linda's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Eleanor, I didn't know you. Now you do, Eleanor said. You need something, Linda. Or are you just here to judge? Linda flushed red. I was going to ask if you wanted to go to church on Sunday. Can't. I'm riding to Missoula with the guys. Riding, Linda looked like she might faint. On a motorcycle. You're 92. And you're nosy. Close the door on your way out, Linda. The woman left without another word. The kitchen erupted in laughter. Damn, Eleanor, Boone said, wiping tears from his eyes. You don't hold back. Never saw the point, Eleanor said. Now stop laughing and check your oven. Those biscuits are about to burn. They scrambled, and somehow in that moment something shifted again. Because Eleanor wasn't just teaching them to cook. She was teaching them to care, to show up for each other, to be the kind of men who knew how to feed the people they loved. And Dalton, watching from across the kitchen, As Eleanor corrected Garrett's kneading technique with the same no-nonsense authority she'd used on Linda Peterson, felt something he thought had died with Hawk. Purpose, not the hollow purpose of leading men into nothing, but real purpose. The kind that made you want to get up in the morning. The kind that reminded you what you were fighting for. He caught Eleanor's eye across the room. She smiled at him. Just a small one, but real. And Dalton Sullivan, 59 years old, president of the Montana chapter of the Hells Angels, felt something warm begin to unfold in his chest. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of something even better. The call came at 11 at night in early January. Dalton was lying in bed, not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling and thinking about how 60 was coming. 6 months away now, like a train barreling down tracks he couldn't see but could feel in the vibration of the rails. His phone lit up. Garrett's name. Dalton answered immediately. "What's wrong?" Heavy breathing on the other end. Not panic, worse. Defeat. "It's Garrett. I need you." "Where are you?" "Iron Horse. Ghost she took him. Reese showed up today with papers. Full custody. Says I'm not fit to be a father because of the club." Dalton was already getting dressed. "I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, he walked into the Iron Horse to find Garrett slumped in a chair in the back room bottle, on its one hand, the other covering his face. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. The kid was 29 years old, covered in tattoos, tried so hard to be hard. But right now, he looked about 12. Dalton sat down across from him. Didn't say anything at first, just sat. Finally, Garrett lowered his hand. His eyes were red, swollen, destroyed. "She took him, Ghost," he whispered. "She took my boy." "I know." "Said I'm a bad influence. Said he's better off without me." His voice cracked. "Maybe she's right." Dalton leaned forward. "Listen to me. You're a good father. You show up. You try. That's what matters." "I can't even see him. She got a restraining order. Says the club's too dangerous." Garrett's face crumpled. "What am I supposed to do?" "You fight it." "How? I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have—" "You have us," Dalton said. The words came out before he'd fully thought them through. But once they were out, he knew they were true. "We'll figure it out." Garrett stared at him like he didn't quite believe it. "You hear me," Dalton said again. "You don't quit. Not on your son. Not ever." They sat with him until 3 in the morning. Didn't say much, didn't need to. Sometimes presence was louder than words. When Dalton finally drove home, the sun was starting to rise over the mountains. He was exhausted, but for the first time in months, his exhaustion felt earned, like he'd actually done something that mattered. 2 days later, Dalton called Eleanor. "We have a situation," he said. She listened while he explained. "Garrett, the custody battle, the restraining order, the ex-wife who saw the club as nothing but criminals and outlaws." When he finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need?" she asked. "I don't know yet. Boone knows a lawyer from his veteran support network, pro bono. But the guy says we need character witnesses, people who can vouch for Garrett." "I'll do it." Dalton blinked. "Eleanor, you don't have to." "When's the hearing?" 3 weeks. "Billings Courthouse." "I'll be there." "It's not your fight." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "It is." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. The lawyer, a guy named Daniel Brennan, who'd served with Boone in Iraq, put together the case. But he was honest about their chances. "The judge sees Hell's Angels. He's going to have preconceptions," Daniel said. "We need to show him something different, something he doesn't expect." That's where Eleanor came in. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Dalton drove Eleanor to Billings the night before, got her a hotel room near the courthouse. They had dinner at a diner that smelled like grease and coffee. "You nervous?" Dalton asked. Eleanor took a sip of her tea. "I stopped being nervous about what people think around 1987. What happened in 1987? House fire. Lost everything except what I was wearing. Stood there and watched 40 years of my life turn to ash." She set down her cup. "After that, a courtroom doesn't seem so scary." Dalton studied her across the table. This woman who'd walked into his world 3 months ago and somehow become essential to it, who taught his brothers how to cook and how to care and how to be human again. "Thank you for doing this," he said. "You don't need to thank me. Garrett's a good kid. He deserves his son." "He's 29, Eleanor smiled. "When you're 92, everyone's a kid." The courtroom was cold the next morning. Old wood and older judgments. Garrett sat at the defendant's table in the only suit he owned, which didn't fit right, and made him look like a child playing dress-up. His ex-wife, Reese, sat on the opposite side with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in a power suit who looked at Garrett like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Dalton sat in the back row with Silas and Boone. They'd wanted to bring the whole club, but Daniel had advised against it. Too intimidating. So it was just the three of them, leather vests, left at home wearing the cleanest shirts they owned. The proceedings started. Reese's lawyer went first, painting a picture of Garrett as an irresponsible gang member who exposed his 6-year-old son to criminal elements. She had evidence, photos of the club, police reports from incidents Garrett had been tangentially involved in, testimony from neighbors who'd seen motorcycles parked outside Garrett's apartment at all hours. Garrett's face got paler with every word. Then it was their turn. Daniel called Eleanor to the stand. She walked up there in a navy dress and pearl sensible heels clicking on the hardwood floor. 92 years old and steady as bedrock. The bailiff swore her in. She sat down, hands folded in her lap, looking at the judge like they were having tea. "Mrs. Crawford," Daniel began, "how do you know the defendant, Garrett Ross?" "He's my friend," Eleanor said clearly. "And how did you meet him?" "He helped me push my car out of the rain." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniel continued, "And you're aware that Mr. Ross is a member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club?" "I am." Reese's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to establish that the Hells Angels are an organization with documented ties to criminal activity." "Objection," Daniel said. "Relevance." "Sustained," the judge said. "Counselor, rephrase." Reese's lawyer paused and tried again. "Mrs. Crawford, do you think it's appropriate for a child to be around members of a motorcycle gang?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly. When she spoke, her voice carried through the courtroom like a bell. "I think it's appropriate for a child to be around people who show up when others don't, who teach him loyalty, responsibility, and what it means to stand by your word. So yes, I think Garrett Ross is exactly the kind of man that boy needs in his life." The lawyer blinked. "But the lifestyle—" "The lifestyle," Eleanor interrupted, "is one where men take care of each other, where they don't walk away when things get hard, where they stop in the rain to help an old woman they've never met." She paused, let that sink in. "You want to talk about character," Eleanor continued. "Let's talk about the fact that Garrett Ross has spent every weekend for the last 2 months learning to cook so he can make his son a decent meal when he visits. Let's talk about the fact that he works 2 jobs to pay child support on time every time. Let's talk about the fact that he loves that boy more than anything in this world." Silence. Complete and total. The judge looked at Reese, then at Garrett, then back at Eleanor. "Anything else, counselor?" he asked Reese's lawyer. The woman shook her head, looking rattled. "You may step down, Mrs. Crawford." Eleanor stood, walked back to her seat. As she passed Garrett's table, their eyes met. His were wet. "Thank you," he mouthed. She nodded. 3 days later, the judge ruled in Garrett's favor. Partial custody, weekends and holidays. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. When Garrett called to tell Eleanor, he was crying so hard he could barely speak. "I got him, Eleanor. I got my boy back." "I know, Garrett. I know. I don't know how to thank you." "You already have." Dalton was there when Garrett hung up. They were at Eleanor's house, her kitchen table covered with paperwork from the case. He looked at her, this woman who'd walked into a courtroom and faced down a judge and a lawyer and won. "You know what you did back there," he said quietly. "What's that?" "You gave him his son. You gave him hope." He paused. "You gave him family." Eleanor's eyes glistened. He already had family. He just needed someone to see it. Dalton reached across the table, took her hand. She squeezed back. And something passed between them, something neither of them had words for yet, but it was there, growing undeniable. 4 weeks later, everything shattered. The call came at 4 in the morning. Dalton was already awake again. Insomnia had been his companion for years now, keeping him company in the dark hours when the house was too quiet and his thoughts too loud. His phone lit up. Garrett's name. Dalton's stomach dropped even before he answered. "What's wrong?" "It's Silas." Garrett's voice was tight, controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to break. "He's in the hospital. Critical condition." Dalton was out of bed, pulling on clothes. "What happened?" "Hit and run. Someone ran him off the road about midnight. He's in surgery now." "Which hospital?" "St. Vincent in Billings." "I'm on my way." The drive usually took 90 minutes. Dalton made it in 70, his bike screaming through the empty Montana night. Fear rode with him the whole way. Not the clean fear of a fight or a crash, the ugly fear of helplessness, of being too late. The waiting room at St. Vincent was packed with leather vests. 40 men sat in silence, faces pale, hands clenched. Some stared at the floor, others at the walls. Nobody spoke. Garrett stood when Dalton walked in. His eyes were hollow. "Any news?" Dalton asked. Garrett shook his head. "Still in surgery. Been 4 hours." Dalton looked around the room. These men, these hard, unbreakable men, they looked terrified. He sat down next to Boone, who was shaking. Not the usual tremor in his hands. This was different. Whole body shaking. "Hey," Dalton said quietly. Boone didn't look at him. "It's my fault." "What?" "We were supposed to ride together last night, but I bailed. Had to work late." His voice cracked. "If I'd been there—" "Stop." Dalton grabbed his arm. "This isn't on you." He was a lone ghost. He shouldn't have been alone. "Boone, listen to me. You being there wouldn't have changed what happened. You understand this isn't your fault." But Boone's face crumpled, and he started to cry. Not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere ancient and broken. Dalton pulled him into a hug. This man who'd survived 2 tours in Iraq, who'd killed and nearly been killed, sobbing into his shoulder like a child. Around them, others started to crack. Garrett wiped his eyes. A guy named Tiny, 6'5" and 300 pounds, turned away to hide his tears. Dalton watched it all, jaw-tight, fists clenched at his sides. He was supposed to be their leader, supposed to have answers, but he had nothing. Just this helpless rage building in his chest. That's when he heard her voice. "Dalton." He turned. Eleanor stood in the doorway, coat over her nightgown, white hair loose around her shoulders. She'd driven 90 minutes in the middle of the night because somehow she'd known. Dalton stood, walked over to her. "How is he?" she asked. "Still in surgery." Eleanor looked past him at the room full of broken men, then back at his face. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "No," she said quietly, "you're not." And something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, like she could see straight through every wall he'd built, made something crack inside Dalton's chest. "I can't fix this," he said. His voice came out rough, almost raw. "They're falling apart, and I can't." Eleanor reached up, put her hand on his cheek. "You're not supposed to fix it. You're supposed to be here. That's enough." 6 hours later, a surgeon in blood-spattered scrubs walked into the waiting room. Everyone stood at once, a wave of motion, and held breath. "Family of Silas Bennett." "We're his family," Dalton said. The surgeon looked at the room full of bikers, paused, then nodded. "He's stable. The surgery went well. We had to repair internal bleeding and reset his leg, but he's going to make it." The room exhaled as one, relief so thick you could feel it, like a physical weight lifting. "Can we see him?" Dalton asked. "Not yet. He's in recovery. Give it a few hours." The surgeon paused. "But he was asking for someone. Said to tell Eleanor he's okay." Every head turned toward her. Eleanor's breath caught. "Me." That's what he said. 2 hours later, they let her in. Silas lay in the hospital bed, pale as the sheets tubes running from his arms. his leg in a cast elevated by wires. His eyes were half open. "Hey, big guy," Eleanor said quietly, pulling a chair next to the bed. Silas's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "You came." "Of course I came." He winced. "Told him. Tell you first." "Why me?" His eyes focused on her. Despite the pain, despite the morphine, they were clear. "Because you're the one who taught me what matters." Eleanor's eyes burned. "What are you talking about?" "Marlo." His voice was weak but steady. "My daughter, she's coming tomorrow. Was supposed to cook for her like you taught me. You'll get another chance." "What if I don't?" "Then I'll teach her myself," Eleanor said firmly. "But you're going to be fine. You hear me? You're going to walk out of here and make that little girl the best damn meal she's ever had." Silas smiled, really smiled this time. Then his eyes closed. Eleanor squeezed his hand, sat there in the quiet of the hospital room and cried. When she walked back into the waiting room, Dalton stood immediately. "How is he?" "He's going to be okay." The tension broke like a dam. Men hugged. Some cried openly. Others just sat down, relief washing over them like water. But Dalton pulled Eleanor aside, voice low. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About who did this." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "You know." "Not yet, but I will." His eyes were hard as stone. "Someone ran him off the road, Eleanor, on purpose. This wasn't an accident." "How do you know?" "Because Silas called me right before it happened. Said a truck had been following him for 10 miles. Black Dodge Ram, no plates, then the line went dead." Fear crawled up Eleanor's spine. "Did you tell the police?" "Yeah, they're looking into it." His jaw tightened. "But you and I both know how that goes." "Dalton, I'm going to find who did this." "And then what?" He didn't answer, didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands were clenched into fists. "Don't," Eleanor said. "Don't what?" "Don't do something you can't take back." Dalton looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked away. The next 2 days passed in a strange, tense calm. Silas recovered faster than anyone expected. The doctors were talking about releasing him within a week. Marlo came to visit, 8 years old with pigtails and her father's smile. She sat next to his bed, told him about school, drew him pictures. Eleanor watched from the doorway, heartbreaking and mending at the same time. But Dalton was gone, out every day asking questions, following leads. Eleanor knew what he was doing, and she knew where it would end. On the third day, he found it. He called her from a diner outside Hardin. "I know who did it." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. "Who?" "Cade Merrick. Used to ride with us. Got kicked out 2 years ago for stealing from the club." Why would he go after Silas? "Because Silas is the one who caught him." Dalton's voice was ice. "I'm heading to his place now." "Dalton, don't." But he'd already hung up. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, heart pounding. She knew that tone, knew what it meant. Dalton was past talking, past reason. He was going to do something that would destroy everything they'd built. She grabbed her car keys and drove. Cade Merrick lived in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of Billings. Eleanor pulled up just as Dalton was walking up the stairs to the second floor. She got out of her car, her 92-year-old legs moving faster than they had in years. "Dalton." He stopped, turned. His eyes were wild, dangerous. "Go home, Eleanor." "No." He walked to the door, knocked. It opened. A man stood there, tall blonde, neck tattoos. Cade Merrick. "Ghost," Cade said, and there was something ugly in his smile. "Been wondering when you'd show up." "Did you do it?" Dalton's voice was quiet, deadly. "Do what?" "Run Silas off the road." Cade's smile widened. "Yeah, I did. So what?" Dalton grabbed him by the shirt, slammed him against the door frame. Eleanor was running now, up the stairs, her chest burning. "Dalton, stop." But Dalton's fist was already drawn back. 42 years of rage and grief and loss coiled in his shoulders, ready to unleash. Eleanor threw herself between them, put both hands on Dalton's chest. Dalton, stop, think, get out of my way. No. Eleanor, think about what happens next. Her voice cracked. You heard him. You go to prison. Everything we've built, everything you've built, it's gone. I don't care. Yes, you do. Eleanor's eyes were wet now. Because these men need you. I need you. Dalton stared at her, breathing hard. His eyes were wet too, furious and broken at the same time. He almost killed Silas. I know. And he'll pay for it, but not like this. A voice called out from below. Police, nobody move. Officer Daniels stepped out of a patrol, our hand on his weapon. Eleanor had called him from the road. Dalton's grip on Cade loosened, slowly, reluctantly. Daniels came up the stairs, looked at Cade. Cade Merrick, you are under arrest for attempted vehicular homicide. Cade's face went pale. Wait, you have the right to remain silent. As Daniels cuffed him, Cade looked at Dalton. This isn't over. Dalton stepped forward. Eleanor grabbed his arm again. Yeah, Dalton said quietly. It is. They watched the patrol car drive away, lights flashing red and blue against the gray afternoon. Then Dalton turned to Eleanor. You called the cops. I did. You had no right. I had every right. Eleanor's voice was shaking now. Anger and fear and love all mixed together. Because I love you, all of you, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you destroy yourselves because of pride or revenge or whatever the hell this was. The words hung in the air between them. Love. Dalton stared at her. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. You love us, he said quietly. Of course I do. Eleanor's voice cracked. You think I've been showing up every week, cooking meals, sitting in hospital rooms, putting up with your nonsense because I'm bored. You're my family, Dalton. The only family I've got. And family doesn't let family destroy themselves. Dalton's eyes filled with tears. He pulled her into a hug, a real one, the kind that breaks you open and puts you back together at the same time. I'm sorry, he whispered, I know. They stood there for a long time in the parking lot of a rundown apartment complex, holding on to each other like lifelines. When they finally pulled apart, Dalton said, You know you're insane, right? Eleanor smiled through her tears. Takes one to know one. That night, Dalton called an emergency meeting at the Iron Horse. Everyone came. The energy was different now. Something had shifted in the air, heavy with meaning. Cade Merrick has been arrested, Dalton said. He confessed to running Silas off the road. He's going away for a long time. Cheers erupted. Relief flooded the room. Then Dalton held up a hand. The room quieted. But we need to talk about what almost happened today. The smiles faded. I almost killed him, Dalton said, his voice steady. And if Eleanor hadn't stopped me, I'd be in a cell right now. And you'd be without a leader, without a brother. He paused, looking at each of them. We've all lost people. We've all been hurt. And it's easy to let that turn into rage, into violence, but that's not who we are anymore. We're better than that. And if we forget that if we let revenge turn us into the monsters people think we are, then we've already lost. Silence filled the room. Then Garrett stood. He's right. We're not killers. We're family. One by one others stood. Boone, a guy named Tiny, a dozen more. And then they all turned to Eleanor. Dalton walked to the bar, pulled out a wooden box from underneath, opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside a patch none of them had ever seen before. The room went completely silent. 42 years, Dalton said, his voice carrying through the space like a bell. 42 years this club has never given this honor. Not once, because it means something. He held up the patch. The leather was dark, worn at the edges with words stitched in silver thread, mother of the club. Eleanor Crawford, he continued, looking directly at her. Come up here. Eleanor shook her head. I don't need come up here, Dalton said again. Not a request, an invitation to something sacred. She walked to the front of the room, her 92-year-old legs feeling every one of those years. The men parted to let her through, and she could feel their eyes on her. Not judgment, something else, something that looked like reverence. When she reached Dalton, he turned to face the club. This woman saved my life tonight. Not just my life, all of ours, because she reminded me what we stand for. He held the patch higher. But it's more than that. She's taught us to cook, to care, to be the kind of men who show up for the people they love. She testified in court for Garrett. She drove 90 minutes in the middle of the night for Silas. She's been here for every one of us when we needed her most. Garrett stepped forward, warm. Then Silas, still on crutches. Then Boone. One by one, every man in that room stood and moved closer, forming a circle around Dalton and Eleanor. "We vote," Dalton said, "because this matters. All in favor of Eleanor Crawford receiving the Mother Patch, the highest honor this club can give." The response was immediate. 40 voices, one word. Aye. Not a single dissent. The sound filled the room, bounced off the walls, hung in the air like a vow. Dalton walked to Eleanor, and then in front of 40 hardened bikers, in front of his entire club, he knelt on one knee in front of her, held out the patch like a proposal, like an offering, like the most important thing he'd ever give anyone. "Will you accept this?" His voice was quiet, now meant just for her. "Will you be our mother?" Eleanor's hands shook. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't try to hide them. She looked at this man kneeling before her, at the patch in his hands, at the circle of faces watching her with hope and love and desperate need. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." Dalton stood. Garrett came forward with Hawk's vest, the one Eleanor had worn since Yellowstone. Together they pinned the mother patch to the leather, right over her heart. The room erupted. Not applause, something deeper. A roar. Stomping feet, fists pounding tables, bottles raised. The sound of 40 men saying this matters without needing words. The sound of a family recognizing its own. Men came forward, hugged her. Some cried. Boone whispered thank you in her ear. Silas, leaning on his crutches, told her, "You saved my life and you didn't even know it." Garrett just held her hand and couldn't speak at all. And Eleanor stood there, surrounded by leather and loyalty and love, wearing a dead man's vest with a patch that said she belonged, and finally understood what she'd been searching for all these years. She'd found her place. And as Dalton pulled her into another hug, as the club gathered around them both, as someone started playing Springsteen on the jukebox and the celebration began in earnest, she realized something else. She'd found him too. 3 months passed. Silas healed. The cast came off his leg in early April, and by the end of the month, he was back on his bike, Marlowe riding behind him in a helmet twice too big for her head, laughing at the wind. Cade Merrick went to trial and got 10 years. Life settled into something that almost felt normal. Almost. Dalton woke up on May 15th in his apartment alone, staring at the ceiling in the pre-dawn darkness. 60 years old. The number didn't sit in his chest like a stone anymore. It felt different now. Not lighter exactly, just different. He got up, made coffee, stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Montana in May was beautiful, green and alive and full of promise. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Dalton could see it, could feel it. But he also felt something else. A certainty that had been building for months, crystallizing into something he couldn't ignore anymore. His phone buzzed. Text from Garrett. "Don't make plans for today." Dalton smiled despite himself. Texted back. "Why, just don't." At 7 in the morning, there was a knock on his door. Dalton opened it to find Eleanor standing there, coat over her nightgown, white hair, loose eyes bright. "Get dressed," she said. "You're coming with me." "Eleanor, what?" "No questions. Just get dressed." 20 minutes later, they were driving through town in her Buick. Dalton kept asking where they were going. Eleanor kept not answering, just smiled, that small, knowing smile that made her look 30 years younger. They pulled up to her house. The lawn was covered with motorcycles, 40 of them lined up in perfect formation. and standing next to them, 40 men in leather vests. Dalton got out of the car slowly, heart hammering. Surprise, Garrett said, grinning. They decorated Eleanor's yard with banners, set up tables with food. Someone had brought a speaker system that was playing Springsteen too loud for 7 in the morning. Happy birthday, Ghost, Silas said. Marlowe was perched on his shoulders, waving a homemade sign that read, 60 is the new 40. Dalton stood there looking at all of them, these men, his brothers, his family, and he felt something crack open in his chest, not pain, something else, something that might have been joy if he remembered what that felt like. You did this, he asked Eleanor. They did this, she said. I just provided the location. The party lasted all day. They ate Eleanor's cooking, told stories, laughed until their sides hurt. Marlowe ran around the yard, 8 years old and fearless, making all the big, scary bikers play tag with her. Silas watched his daughter with an expression that was pure contentment. Around noon, Boone called for a toast. Everyone grabbed a beer or a soda or whatever was closest. To Ghost, Boone said, raising his bottle. 60 years of being the toughest son of a bitch any of us ever met. To Ghost. Dalton felt his throat tighten. He raised his own bottle but couldn't quite get words out. Then Garrett spoke up. Speech? I'm not giving a speech. Come on, old man. You're 60. You've earned it. The others joined in. Speech, speech. Dalton looked around at them. At Eleanor, who was watching him with those sharp eyes that saw everything. At Garrett, who had his son back. At Silas, who was alive and whole and teaching his daughter to be brave. At Boone, whose hands were steady today. All right, he said finally, but I'll keep it short. They quieted. Dalton took a breath. 60 years ago, I came into this world. 42 years ago, I found this club. And for most of that time, I thought I knew what I was doing. Thought I was leading you somewhere. He paused. But lately, I've been wondering, what are we actually riding toward? More funerals, more loss. His voice caught slightly. I've buried too many brothers, watched too many good men fall, and I'm tired. The smiles faded. Nobody moved. I'm tired of pretending I have all the answers, Dalton continued. Tired of carrying this weight alone. And I'm starting to think, he looked at Eleanor, I'm starting to think there's more to life than just riding until you can't anymore. Silence filled the yard. Then Dalton raised his bottle again. So here's to 60, and to whatever comes next. They drank, but the energy had shifted. Something heavy hung in the air that hadn't been there before. Later, after most of the brothers had left, Garrett pulled Dalton aside. You okay? The kid asked. Yeah, why? That speech. That didn't sound like you. Dalton was quiet for a moment. What if I told you I was thinking about stepping down? Garrett's face went pale. What? I'm 60, Garrett. I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, and I'm tired. You can't step down. You're the club. No, Dalton said quietly. The club is bigger than me. It has to be. But who would you? Garrett looked like he'd been punched. Me. You're ready. You've grown more in the last 6 months than most men do in 6 years. You fought for your son. You learned what really matters. That makes you a better leader than I ever was. Ghost, I can't. Yeah, you can. Dalton put a hand on his shoulder. And you will. He walked away, leaving Garrett standing there stunned. Eleanor found him on her back porch, sitting on the steps looking out at the mountains. You're really going to do it, she said. Not a question. Yeah, she sat down next to him. Their shoulders touched. What will you do? Dalton was quiet for a long time. I don't know yet, but I know I can't keep doing this, leading these men toward nothing, watching them break, watching them fall. He looked at her. There has to be more. There is, Eleanor said quietly. What? She took his hand. Life, Dalton. There's life, if you're willing to choose it. They sat there as the sun started to set, painting the Montana sky gold and pink, and Dalton felt something shift inside him. Some gear that had been stuck for 42 years finally starting to turn again. 4 weeks later, the letter arrived. Eleanor was at Dalton's apartment when he opened it. They'd been having dinner together most nights now. Nothing romantic. Not yet. Just two people who'd found each other late and were trying to figure out what that meant. Dalton's face went dark as he read. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. He handed her the letter. Official letterhead. Hells Angels National Headquarters. "This is to inform you that your charter is under review. An audit will be conducted on July 15th. All financial records must be made available. Failure to comply will result in revocation of your charter." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "They're trying to shut you down." "Yeah." "Why anonymous complaints?" Dalton's jaw tightened. "Someone's been feeding them information about us." "Can they do this?" "They can do whatever they want. They're national." He stood up, started pacing. "We need to make sure the books are clean. No irregularities, nothing they can use against us." "Who handles your finances?" "Knox Palmer. We call him Wrench. He's been treasurer for 3 years." Dalton pulled out his phone. "I'll call him, have him bring everything over tomorrow." But when Dalton called, Knox didn't answer. Didn't answer the next 3 times either. "That's weird," Dalton said. "He always answers." Eleanor felt ice crawl up her spine. "Dalton, I think we should look at those books tonight." They drove to the clubhouse, used Dalton's key to get into the office, found the filing cabinet where Knox kept all the financial records, and spent the next 5 hours going through every transaction, every receipt, every bank statement from the past year. By 3 in the morning, Eleanor had found it. "Dalton." He looked up from the stack of invoices he was sorting. "What?" "There are inconsistencies here. Transactions that don't match up." He came over, looked at what she was pointing to. His face went dark. "How much?" Eleanor did the math in her head. "About 15,000 over the past year. Small amounts, 100 here, 200 there, but it adds up." "Son of a bitch. Who has access to these accounts?" "Just Knox." Dalton's fists clenched. "He's been skimming." He pulled out his phone, called Knox again. This time the man answered. "Ghost, hey, I was gonna call you. My office, now. It's 3 in the morning. I don't care. Get here. Now." 20 minutes later, Knox Palmer walked into the clubhouse. 45 years old, solid build arms, covered in engine grease tattoos. He'd been with the club for 8 years. Been treasurer for 3. Dalton had trusted him. Knox took one look at the papers spread across the desk, and his face went white. "We know what you did," Dalton said. His voice was ice. "I can explain. You stole from the club. I was going to pay it back. My daughter needed surgery. The insurance wouldn't cover it. I didn't know what else to do." The words hit Dalton like a physical blow, because he understood. God help him, he understood. When your kid needs something and you can't provide it, you do desperate things. But that didn't change what Knox had done. "Why didn't you ask?" Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Why didn't you come to us?" Knox looked at her and his eyes were wet. "Because I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't handle his own problems." "A burden." Eleanor's voice rose. "You think asking for help makes you a burden after everything we've been through, after everything we've built?" Knox's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Dalton stood up, walked around the desk, looked Knox in the eye. "You're out," he said quietly, "effective immediately." "Ghost, please." "You lied. You stole. There's no coming back from that." Knox looked at Eleanor, at the papers on the desk, at Dalton's face, which was carved from stone. Then he turned and walked out. Didn't say another word, just left. The door closed behind him. Dalton sat down heavily in his chair. "We're 15 grand short," he said. "The audit's in 3 weeks. If National finds this, they'll pull our charter." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to her purse, pulled out her checkbook, started writing. "What are you doing?" Dalton asked. She ripped out the check, handed it to him. $15,000. Dalton stared at it. Eleanor, I can't. Yes, you can. This is your life savings. I know what it is. I can't take this from you. You're not taking it, Eleanor said firmly. I'm giving it. There's a difference. Dalton's hands were shaking. We'll pay you back. I don't want you to pay me back. I want you to remember this. She stepped closer to him. The next time someone's struggling, the next time someone's too proud to ask for help, you remember. You remember that family means showing up even when it costs you everything. Dalton looked at her. This woman, this impossible, stubborn, beautiful woman who'd walked into his life 8 months ago and changed everything. You're giving us $15,000. I am. Your entire life savings. Yes. Why? Eleanor reached up, put her hand on his cheek. Because you're my family, Dalton. All of you. And this is what family does. He pulled her into a hug, held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting under his feet. Thank you, he whispered. You're welcome. The audit happened 3 weeks later. 3 men in suits showed up with clipboards and attitudes, sat in the clubhouse office for 6 hours going through every line item, every receipt, asking pointed questions, trying to find holes. They found nothing. Dalton sat across from them with Eleanor at his side, calm and prepared. When they questioned a transaction, Eleanor had the receipt. When they asked about an expense, Dalton had the explanation. They were a team, unshakable. At the end of 6 hours, the lead auditor closed his notebook. Everything appears to be in order. Good, Dalton said. However, we've received complaints about the club's activities. Community disturbances, noise violations. From who? Dalton asked. Anonymous sources. Eleanor leaned forward. Anonymous meaning you don't have proof. The auditor looked at her. And you are Eleanor Crawford. I live 3 blocks from the clubhouse, and I've never heard a single complaint from any actual neighbor. Mrs. Crawford, this doesn't concern. It concerns me plenty, Eleanor interrupted. These men are my family, and if someone has a problem with them, they can say it to my face instead of hiding behind anonymous complaints. The auditor blinked, clearly not used to being challenged by a 92-year-old woman. We're done here, Dalton said, standing. Unless you have gross evidence of wrongdoing, you can leave. The auditors exchanged looks, then packed up their things. We'll be in touch, the lead auditor said. 2 weeks later, the call came. The charter was safe. No violations found. Case closed. The club celebrated that night. Music, food, laughter, relief. But Dalton pulled Eleanor aside away from the noise. I need to tell you something, he said. What? I talked to Garrett, made it official. He's taking over as president next month. Eleanor's eyes widened. You're really doing it? Yeah. What will you do? Dalton took a breath. I bought a piece of land up by the lake. Been thinking about building a cabin, spending time fishing, less time worrying. Sounds lonely. It doesn't have to be. He looked at her. Really looked. Eleanor, I'm 60 years old. I've spent 42 years on the road. Never had a home. Never let anyone close. Always thought that made me free. He paused. But you showed me something. Showed me that freedom isn't running. It's knowing when to stop. And who to stop for. Eleanor's breath caught. I know you're 92, Dalton continued. I know people will talk. I know this doesn't make sense on paper, but I don't care. His voice got quiet, vulnerable. I love you, Eleanor. I don't know how to do this at 60. Don't know if I'm any good at it, but I want to try. Tears ran down Eleanor's face. I'm 92, Dalton. I know. People will think you're crazy. Let them. He took her hands. I've spent my whole life not caring what people think. I'm not starting now. Eleanor looked at him. This man who'd stopped in the rain when nobody else would, who'd given her a family, who'd shown her it wasn't too late to start over. I don't know how to do this either, she whispered. Then we'll figure it out together. She kissed him. right there in the parking lot of the Iron Horse with music and laughter spilling out the door. And Dalton Sullivan, 60 years old, former president of the Hells Angels Montana chapter, kissed her back. And for the first time in 42 years, he felt like he'd finally come home. 6 months later, Leonard stood in a small cabin by a lake watching Dalton cook breakfast. Or try to. He was burning the bacon again. "You're burning the bacon," she said. "I am not." "Yes, you are. I can smell it." Dalton looked at the pan, swore, pulled it off the heat. Eleanor laughed. "I told you. You're going to hold this over me forever, aren't you?" "Absolutely." They ate on the porch, watched the sunrise over the water. Didn't say much, didn't need to. Later, Garrett called. The new president, only 29 years old but growing into the role, learning what it meant to lead not through fear or force, but through love. "Mom," he said. Eleanor smiled every time he called her that. "We're having a ride this weekend. You coming?" "Wouldn't miss it." "Good. Bring Ghost. Silas is making chili." Eleanor hung up, looked at Dalton. "We're expected this weekend." "I heard." "You okay with that?" Dalton pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "As long as you're with me, I'm okay with anything." Saturday came. They rode out with the club, Eleanor behind Dalton, arms around his waist, wind in her hair, feeling more alive than she had in decades. They stopped at a rest area halfway to Missoula. Everyone dismounted, stretched, laughed. Marlo ran up to Eleanor, 9 years old now, pigtails flying. "Grandma Eleanor, watch this." She did a cartwheel, almost landed it. "That was great, sweetheart." "Daddy's teaching me to ride a bike next, a motorcycle, I mean." "Is he now?" Silas walked over, and the look on his face was pure contentment. "If that's okay with you." Eleanor looked at this man who'd been broken and lost when they met, who was whole now, happy, building a life with his daughter. It's more than okay. As the day wore on, as the sun began to set over the Montana mountains, Eleanor realized something. This had all started with one moment, one choice, to keep pushing when everyone else drove past. And 40 men had made the choice to stop. That choice changed everything, gave her family, purpose, love, taught her that needing people wasn't weakness, it was strength. That family wasn't about blood or obligation, it was about showing up even when it was hard. Especially then. And as the sun set, as 40 motorcycles rumbled toward home, Eleanor sat behind Dalton and thought about everything she'd lost and everything she'd found. Her husband, her old life, 25 years of guilt and loneliness. But in return, she'd found this, these people, this man. She'd found herself. The rain had brought them together that day on Highway 87, but it was the choice to stop to see someone struggling and decide they mattered that built something unbreakable. Dalton felt her arms tighten around his waist. He put one hand over hers, squeezed. They rode into the sunset, two people who'd found each other late but found each other completely, surrounded by family, heading home. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The highway stretched out ahead of them, dark and endless. But Dalton wasn't afraid anymore, wasn't tired, because he'd finally figured out what Hawk had meant in that hospital room. "Don't let this place kill you. Find something worth stopping for." He had. Eleanor's voice came through the wind, barely audible over the engine. "Where are we going?" Dalton smiled. "Anywhere you want." And they rode on together into whatever came next. Because that's what family does. They show up, they stop, they stay, and they ride.